Ignored her whole life, she finally cut her family out, but what they did after her wedding proved every suspicion was right. And her brother's shocking confession? No one saw it coming. I didn't invite my parents or my brother to my wedding, and now that the truth's out, everyone finally sees why. For years, they treated me like a background character in my own life, always dropping everything for my brother's so-called medical emergencies. But the part that still haunts me isn't just the neglect, it's what I found out after the wedding, when everything I'd suspected for years was finally confirmed. If you'd seen us when we were kids, me, Neil, Mom and Dad, you'd probably think we were just another suburban family on the edge of Chicago, tucked into a cookie-cutter house with fresh paint and trimmed hedges. The kind where neighbors wave on the way to work and backyard barbecues are just part of life. But when I think about those years now, all I see is how invisible I became the day my brother was diagnosed with asthma. Neil was 7 when it started. Just a mild attack during soccer practice, nothing life-threatening, barely enough to raise an eyebrow. The doctor said it was manageable, routine even, but you'd have thought the world had ended by the way my parents reacted. Overnight, they became obsessed with Neil's health, acting like every cough was a crisis, every sneeze a red alert. I was 9 at the time, and in one brutal weekend, I went from being the eldest child to a background prop in the Neil show. It was subtle at first, canceled playdates, missed recitals, but by the time I hit 12, it was like clockwork. Every time something important happened in my life, Neil would have some kind of medical flare-up that demanded all their attention. My first major piano recital? He had an asthma attack the night of, so they never showed. A month later, my grandma told me he was perfectly fine that evening, playing video games like nothing happened. The next big event? My 16th birthday. My grandparents flew in from Florida, my friends were coming over, and I had been counting down the days. That morning, my parents promised to grab the cake and decorations, then disappeared for the rest of the day. Neil had an urgent doctor visit. They got home late that night. The cake had been half-eaten. By them. It became routine. Graduation? Missed it. Neil had anxiety over finals. College acceptance? They were dealing with Neil's sleep issues. Every milestone in my life got shoved to the back burner, sacrificed at the altar of Neil's endless, vague ailments. I started to believe maybe I really wasn't worth showing up for. That maybe I was just less. By the time I got to college, I didn't even bother telling them about honors or awards. I worked double shifts to afford tuition, scraped by on 4 hours of sleep, and clawed my way to a 4.0 GPA in chemical engineering. All while Neil sat comfortably at home with a college fund they had built just in case his health got worse. He didn't even use most of it. His asthma barely needed an inhaler anymore. But the money stayed untouched just in case he needed support. When I met Jamie, my now husband, he couldn't believe I didn't invite my family to my master's graduation. I didn't even reserve them seats. I told him the truth, they weren't going to come. And sure enough, the morning of the ceremony, I got a text. Neil had a migraine. They wouldn't make it. That night, he posted pictures from a party. No sign of a headache. Jamie's family welcomed me like I was one of their own. First birthday with them? A surprise party. When I got a promotion, his mom sent flowers. His sister framed my first published research paper. I cried, not because of the gesture, but because I didn't know how to receive that kind of love. I'd never had it before. So when Jamie proposed and we started planning the wedding, I had to face a brutal question. Did I want my family there? Could I risk my wedding becoming another event derailed by my brother's latest health drama? The answer came to me late one night, lying awake, staring at the ceiling with Jamie's hand wrapped in mine. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go through that again. I made the call, I wouldn't invite them. And I thought that would be the hardest part. But that was just the beginning. The morning of our wedding, I woke up to sunlight pouring through the curtains of the little lakefront inn we'd rented for the weekend, and for the first time in my life, there was no knot in my chest. No anxiety about who might ruin the day or what excuse I'd be handed for another no-show. I sat up in bed next to Jamie and realized I didn't have to brace myself for disappointment. I had already made the decision to keep it away. We kept our guest list small, under 100 people, mostly Jamie's family, a few close friends, and my grandparents who had always been the only ones in my family to see me. His sisters were my bridesmaids, and his mom helped me into my dress that morning like she'd done it 100 times before, even though we'd only known each other a few years. She told me I looked radiant and hugged me like I'd always belonged to her family. And when I walked down that aisle, arm in arm with Jamie's dad, who offered to give me away without hesitation, I didn't see empty seats where my parents should have been. I saw a room full of people who wanted to be there, who weren't waiting for an excuse to leave, who weren't checking their phones for the next fabricated emergency. I saw my future, not my past. We danced, we laughed, we toasted. His family made speeches that left me in tears. His mom talked about the first time I came over for dinner and how she knew then that Jamie had found someone special. His dad said he'd watched me fight tooth and nail to build a life for myself and that he was honored to be part of my journey now. I nearly broke down right there in my wedding dress. It wasn't just the celebration itself. It was the freedom. No checking my phone every 5 minutes. No wondering if my mom was going to burst in crying or if Neil would have another sudden episode. Just joy, uninterrupted. I kept thinking, so this is what it's like to have a day that's yours. Of course, it couldn't stay perfect forever. We hadn't even left for our honeymoon when the calls started rolling in. At first, I ignored them. My cousin had posted a few photos from the reception, nothing big, just a shot of me and Jamie under the lights during our first dance. But it was enough. My mother saw them. And within an hour, my phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree. The first voicemail from my mom started off calm, too calm. She said she couldn't believe I'd do something so cruel that I had humiliated them by cutting them out. Then the tone shifted. She accused me of resenting Neil for things he couldn't control. She actually said, "You've always been jealous of him and now you're just showing your true colors." My father's message was shorter but no less vicious. "You've made your bed. Don't come crawling back when you regret it." Then came the texts. My uncle, who'd always stayed neutral, wrote, "You broke your mother's heart." Another cousin sent, "Family is family. You don't turn your back on them for a wedding." It was like they all forgot, or maybe never bothered to notice, how many times my family had turned their backs on me. Jamie saw the messages and tried to take my phone, but I told him no. I needed to see it. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with now that I had drawn the line. The kicker came 2 days later when my cousin Kay called, voice low and cautious, and said, "You're not going to believe this," but Neil wasn't even upset. He was at a baseball game the day of your wedding, laughing and drinking like he didn't have a care in the world. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But that wasn't the part that really crushed me. The part that truly broke me came a few days after that, when Jamie's mom, who's a pediatric nurse, mind you, called my mom. She had hoped, somehow, to ease the tension. Maybe even help arrange a little family dinner to patch things up. But during the call, she gently brought up how Neil's lifestyle didn't quite match the fragile narrative my parents had built over the years. She mentioned the hiking trips, the basketball leagues, even the recent 10K he'd finished. My mom hung up on her. No explanation. No apology. Just silence, and then a complaint sent to Jamie's sister about how his family was interfering in private matters. That was the moment I knew deep down they weren't just blind to what they had done. They chose it. They chose to ignore me, to enable Neil, to gaslight me into believing I was always overreacting. And now that I'd finally stood my ground, they couldn't handle the mirror I was holding up. They weren't sorry for what they did. They were just furious I had stopped letting them get away with it. You know what's funny? I spent most of my 20s convincing myself that maybe it wasn't so bad, that maybe I was just being too sensitive or bitter. I'd tell myself, they love you, they're just overwhelmed, or Neil's not trying to hurt you, he just needs more help. I bent over backward trying to justify years of being treated like an afterthought. But after that wedding, after that phone call from Jamie's mom got shut down without even a word of acknowledgement, I stopped lying to myself. And the memories? They started pouring back in like floodwater. One in particular hit me hard. I hadn't thought about it in years, but out of nowhere, it came back like it had just happened yesterday. I was 17, working part-time at a grocery store, saving up for homecoming. I'd been nominated for homecoming court, me, the quiet overachiever who barely had time to breathe, let alone campaign. But it happened and I wanted to look the part. I saved for 3 months to buy this dress I saw in a boutique window, this stunning navy gown with these little bead details across the neckline. The night of the dance, I was curling my hair, nerves tying knots in my stomach, when suddenly my parents came rushing into the room, panicked, frantic. Neil had severe abdominal pain and they were taking him to the ER. I remember asking if they'd be back in time, if they could drop me off first. My mom didn't even look at me. She just said, "Be ready in case we get back." I sat there for hours in that dress, checking my phone, listening to the ticking of the hallway clock echo like a drumbeat. Eventually, my date texted saying he couldn't wait any longer. I missed the dance. Missed the announcement. Missed everything. Neil? He had gas. Literally. Not appendicitis. Not anything serious. Just gas. And that dress? It never left the closet. Tag still on, like a little price sticker on all the moments I lost. That memory came back after the wedding and suddenly all the others followed. The time I won a scholarship to a summer science program but couldn't go because Neil had a rough couple of weeks and my parents didn't want to be away from him. Or when I got my first paid internship and they missed the award ceremony because Neil had a headache. I'd built an entire life out of pieces they never bothered to notice, held together with duct tape and determination, and they still acted like I was the selfish one. But then came the call from Kay. Kay, my cousin, had always been kind of the neutral one, never really picked sides, always tried to keep the peace. But this time she wasn't calling to smooth things over. She was calling because she couldn't stay quiet anymore. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low like she was confessing to something sacred. "Neil told me a few years ago he used to fake stuff. On purpose. At first, I thought I misheard her." She went on. "He told me he liked the attention. That he'd mess with the timing of it all, especially if something big was going on with you. He said it was just so easy to make your parents freak out, he made a game out of it." She said it happened during a family get-together when they were teenagers. Neil had too much to drink, started bragging about how he could pull the strings anytime he wanted. Kay hadn't said anything all these years because she didn't want to stir up family drama, but after the wedding fallout she felt like I deserved to know. I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, hand trembling. I wasn't even surprised. That's what hurt the most. I wasn't shocked. It was like confirmation of a truth I'd carried for years but had never dared to speak aloud. And then she sent me the texts. From my mother. Messages sent just a week before the wedding. Plans. Schemes. My mom was actually discussing ways to prepare in case Neil needed extra support during the ceremony. One line said he might feel unwell with all the emotion, maybe we should sit near the aisle so we can step out quickly if needed. They didn't even know they weren't invited yet. And they were already plotting how to turn my wedding into another Neil-centered event. I showed the texts to Jamie. He didn't say a word. Just pulled me into his arms and held me until my legs stopped shaking. We sent those texts to a few relatives, ones who had been critical of my decision not to invite my parents. One by one, the apologies started coming in. Even my uncle, who had been radio silent for years, messaged to say I had no idea. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." And that changed something inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the crazy one. I wasn't the bitter daughter, the jealous sibling. I was just the person who had finally said enough. But the reckoning wasn't over. Because Neil? He wasn't finished with me yet. And what he did next turned everything upside down. The message came out of nowhere. It was a Tuesday, late evening, and Jamie and I had just finished unpacking the last of our moving boxes. We'd relocated to Boston, fresh start, new jobs, no ghosts in the hallway. I was standing in the kitchen, heating up leftovers, when I saw the notification on my phone. Subject line, "I'm sorry." Sender? Neil. My hands went cold. I just stared at it for a long moment before I opened it, heart pounding like a warning drum. I'd reached out to him after the wedding more than once, brief messages, nothing confrontational, just an invitation to talk, to clear the air if he wanted. He never responded. Until now. The email was long, rambling at times, but honest, brutally honest in a way I never expected from him. And the very first line knocked the wind out of me. "You were right to leave us out of your wedding. You deserved better than all of us." I read every word 3 times over. He talked about therapy, how he started going a few months back, not for me or my parents, but because he couldn't take the guilt anymore. It had started as sessions for anxiety and depression, but his therapist quickly realized there were deeper patterns at play. Patterns rooted in manipulation, attention-seeking, and a twisted family system where being sick had become his only currency. Neil said he used to feel invisible unless he was ill. That the only time our parents paid attention to him, really noticed him, was when he was struggling or in pain. So he leaned into it. Fake things. Amplified symptoms. He admitted that by middle school he already knew what to say to get them to cancel plans, skip events, rush him to the ER for nothing. He confessed to ruining my birthday party, the graduation, even the summer scholarship. "I didn't want you to succeed," he wrote, "because every time you did, I disappeared." He said our parents made his illnesses into a kind of idol, and he became addicted to that worship because it was the only kind of love they seemed capable of giving. But then came the part that hit the deepest. "When Kay showed me the texts from Mom about disrupting your wedding, I threw up," he wrote. "I always knew they prioritized me in unfair ways, but I never thought she would plan to sabotage you like that. And I realized then, I wasn't the only one sick in this family." He went on to say that for years he believed our parents were just loving him the best they could. But now, through therapy, he was beginning to understand that what they did to both of us wasn't love, it was dysfunction. He said they hurt him by encouraging the lie, rewarding his symptoms, and letting him believe that being helpless was the only way to be loved. And they hurt me over and over again by making me pay the price for his needs. By the time I finished reading, I was crying into Jamie's shirt. Not because I was angry, but because for the first time in our lives, Neil had stepped out from behind the curtain. He saw it. All of it. He ended the email with this: "If you're open to it, I'd like to meet. Just you and me. No parents. No drama. Just a conversation." I sat on the floor for a long time after that. Jamie offered to go with me if I wanted backup. But I knew, deep down, this was something I had to do on my own. I needed to look my brother in the eye, not as a rival or a symptom or a ghost from the past, but as someone trying to climb out of the same hole I'd escaped years ago. We met at a small coffee shop off a quiet side street in Boston, just a few blocks from my new office. He looked older than I remembered. Not in a bad way, just more worn, more real. He stood as I walked in, gave me a nervous smile, and we sat without hugging. The conversation started awkward. Surface-level stuff. Weather. Work. Boston traffic. Then he got quiet and said, "I don't even know where to start." So I started for him. "You don't have to fix everything in one talk. But I need to know, do you actually want a relationship with me, or is this about easing your guilt?" He didn't hesitate. Both. But mostly the first one. And so we talked. For hours. About growing up in that house, about what it did to both of us. He told me things I never knew, that our parents would praise him for not making a scene if I cried during an argument, or that Mom once told him, "Don't worry, she's strong. She'll be fine on her own." Like it was some badge of honor to be emotionally abandoned. I told him about the missed moments. The dress I never wore. The graduation speech they didn't hear. The nights I walked home from work in the snow because they couldn't leave Neil alone. And he didn't make excuses. He just listened. Really listened. Near the end, he said something I'll never forget. "They made me the center of the universe. But all that did was make me hollow. You built a world without them. And I admire you more than I ever did when we were kids." We left that cafe with a handshake, not a hug. A cautious peace. But it was enough. Enough to start again, maybe not as siblings who grew up together, but as adults finally telling the truth. I walked away lighter than I'd felt in years. But while Neil was trying to build something new, our parents, they were already planning their next move. And this time, they weren't coming after him. They were coming after me. I should have seen it coming. The second Neil reached out to me, it was only a matter of time before our parents found out, and when they did, I didn't expect celebration. I expected fury. But what I didn't expect was just how fast and how low they'd sink once they realized they were losing control of both of us. It started with a voicemail from my dad. He sounded calm, too calm, like a predator stalking slow in the brush. "We heard Neil's been in touch," he said. "We're concerned about his condition. You should really be careful encouraging him. He's vulnerable." That word, vulnerable, landed like a punch to the chest. Even now, they were trying to frame me as the threat, as the destabilizing force in his life, not the years of emotional manipulation they piled onto both of us. Then came the texts. My mom, as always, led with guilt. "I can't believe you're poisoning him against us after everything we've done." And then the accusations followed. I'd brainwashed Neil, I was erasing the family, I was selfishly breaking what little was left of our home. But the real storm hit when Neil made the mistake of leaving his email open on my parents' shared home computer. I guess he didn't think twice about it. He was visiting, trying to play it civil, probably thinking they were finally ready to let go of the past. Instead, they read the email he sent me. Every word of it. That's when things exploded. They threatened to cut him off entirely: money, housing, car, everything. And yeah, Neil wasn't exactly independent yet. He had a part-time gig with a startup that hadn't broken even. His apartment? Paid for by them. The car he drove? Also theirs. It was like they'd built this little gilded cage around him and convinced him he couldn't live without it. And now that he was trying to leave it, they were slamming the door shut. But to his credit, Neil didn't cave. He sent me a message that night, short, blunt, but strong. "I'm done. I'll find a way to stand on my own. I can't live like this anymore." And just like that, the only child they'd ever really invested in was slipping through their fingers. So they did what they always did when they felt cornered: they went on the attack. But this time, it wasn't just emotional warfare. It was sabotage. They started calling Jamie's family. Not just once, not just casually. His mother, his sister, even his uncle, who they'd only met once at a Christmas dinner. They were trying to explain the full story, spinning this narrative that I'd turned their family upside down, that I was mentally unstable, that I had a long history of resentment and attention-seeking. Jamie's mom, God bless her, tried to be diplomatic at first. She called me after the third voicemail from my mother and said gently, "I think they're spiraling, sweetheart. They're not even trying to hide the fact that they're lying." Then came the email they sent to our extended family. Yes, an email, subject line, what you deserve to know. It was a full-blown character assassination painting me as the unstable daughter who cut ties without warning, pressured Neil into turning against his family and manipulated everyone around her to make herself the victim. I didn't even find out from them, I found out from Kay. She forwarded me the whole thing, then followed up with a one-line message that meant more to me than anything they could have said. I see you. I always have. That's when I stopped holding back. I forwarded the messages from my mom, the ones where she plotted to create a health incident during my wedding. I included Neil's email with his permission and explained exactly what had been happening in our family for the past 2 decades. I didn't write some dramatic expose. I just laid out the facts, plain and undeniable. And the silence that followed? That was louder than any apology could have been. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all went quiet. A few reached out privately, some just to say they were sorry for not seeing it sooner, some to admit they had always suspected something wasn't right but never felt it was their place to say. My uncle, the same one who once told me I was too sensitive, called me in tears, said he saw now how the pattern had always been there. But even as the truth came to light, my parents dug in deeper. They began spreading a new story. That I was suffering from delusional memories, that Jamie's family was manipulating me to cut ties, that I was on the verge of a breakdown and no one was stepping in to stop it. And that's when Jamie stepped in. He called my dad directly, told him if he contacted me or anyone in his family again, we'd pursue a harassment claim. My dad laughed at first, said Jamie was just another fool being led around by a bitter little girl. But Jamie didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just said, "We're done letting you hurt her. Keep pushing and we'll make it legal." Click. No more calls after that. But one final blow was still coming. Because someone else had been watching all of this unfold. Someone I hadn't expected to take a side. And when they finally did, it would change everything. It was 2 days after Jamie made that call to my father when I got a message that stopped me cold. It wasn't from Neil. It wasn't from Kay. It was from someone I hadn't heard from in months, my Aunt Laura. Now, you have to understand, Laura's my mom's older sister, and for as long as I can remember, she was the one person in the family who always walked the tightrope, never getting involved, never picking sides, just floating in that safe zone where nobody could accuse her of betrayal or favoritism. She wasn't cruel, just distant. I figured she preferred it that way. But this message? It was different. "Call me when you can," it said. "I think it's time you knew everything." I stared at those words for a while, then stepped out onto our apartment balcony and dialed her number. The city below felt calm for once, like even the air knew something important was about to break loose. She answered right away. "No small talk, no warm-up. I've stayed quiet too long," she said. "And I'm sorry for that. But your wedding and what your mother tried to do. I can't keep my mouth shut anymore." What she told me next confirmed everything I'd suspected and a whole lot I hadn't. She told me my mom had always made excuses for Neil even before the asthma diagnosis. She remembered when I was 10 and got an award at school for academic excellence. My mom never mentioned it once at a family dinner. Instead, she talked about how Neil had a stomachache earlier that week and had to miss soccer practice. "It was always that way," Aunt Laura said, her voice heavy with regret. "Every time you had something good happen, your mom redirected the conversation back to Neil. I noticed it. So did your grandmother. But we thought, well, maybe it was just her way of coping with stress." Then she dropped the hammer. She told me once, Laura said, that you didn't need as much attention because you were independent by nature. That you were built to be alone. And I didn't correct her. I just let it slide. That broke me. Not because it was shocking, but because it was exactly the kind of backhanded justification I had lived under for years. The idea that my strength meant I didn't deserve support. That my resilience excused their neglect. But Aunt Laura wasn't done. "I was at that family reunion 3 years ago," she said, "the one where you got that big promotion. I remember you were so proud, talking about your new research position. And your mother just waved it off and started talking about how Neil got a job bagging groceries." She paused for a moment. "That's when I knew it wasn't about his needs. It was about her need to make you small." That sentence hit me like a freight train. I realized in that moment I'd been fighting not just Neil's manipulation, not just Dad's silence, but Mom's deep, unshakable need to control the narrative. To always be the martyr, the mother of a fragile boy, and the long-suffering parent doing the best she could. And I had disrupted that story. My success, my wedding, my happiness, they weren't part of her script. They were a threat to it. "I want you to know," Aunt Laura said quietly, "that you're not imagining any of this. You never were. And I'm telling the rest of the family. I won't be silent anymore." It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a declaration of truth. And just like that, I wasn't standing alone anymore. After that call, the tide began to turn in ways I never thought possible. Aunt Laura started speaking up during family calls. She showed the wedding text messages from my mom to our other relatives. One by one, people started reaching out, not all of them, not the ones too far gone, but enough. Even my cousin Eric, who'd once called me dramatic, texted me, "I was wrong. I see it now. I won't pretend it healed everything." It didn't. But for the first time, they were the ones being questioned. For the first time, I wasn't the problem. And Neil? He stayed strong. Moved into a studio apartment in a cheaper neighborhood, started applying for full-time jobs. He even joined a therapy group for adults who grew up in families with medical over-identification and emotional neglect. Apparently, that's an actual thing. I guess when you live through something long enough, it becomes real even in textbooks. He texted me one night, "Every time I breathe without needing attention, I think of you." It was simple, but it meant everything. Still, there was one final piece I hadn't dealt with yet. My parents. They'd gone quiet since Jamie's warning. But that silence? It was never going to last. Because next came the apology. And like everything else with them, it wasn't what it seemed. I should have known they wouldn't stay silent forever. People like my parents don't retreat, they reload. And sure enough, about 3 weeks after Aunt Laura started speaking up and Neil finally moved out on his own, I got the message I knew was coming. It was from my mother. A long, meandering email filled with flowery language, selective memory, and the kind of emotional manipulation I could spot a mile away. The subject line read, "Can we start over?" But it wasn't about starting over. It was about rewriting history. She opened with how hurt she was by the distance between us and how she wished things could go back to the way they were. She wrote that she'd been reflecting deeply and that families go through hard times. But not once did she mention what she'd done. Not the missed graduations. Not the cake she let Neil eat alone in a hospital room while I sat at home with paper plates and a frozen pizza. Not the plot to derail my wedding with a made-up health scare. Instead, she wrote this, "I know we weren't perfect, but we always did what we thought was best. You were always so strong, and we thought you didn't need us as much." There it was again. That same poison compliment. You're strong, so we left you to struggle. You're capable, so we gave everything to someone else. You're independent, so we ignored your pain. The next paragraph was about Neil. Of course. She claimed he'd been going through a rough patch emotionally and that I should be gentle with him. She said she was glad he and I were reconnecting, but added almost as a side note that she hoped I wouldn't let therapy twist his view of the past. I read that line 3 times. Then I closed the email. I didn't reply. But the next day, a card arrived in the mail. A real one. Handwritten. From my father. I stood in the kitchen, card in one hand, coffee in the other, and braced myself. It started off simple, "I don't know what happened to us, but I'd like to fix it." Then it veered. "Your mother and I have been under a lot of pressure lately. Neil's therapist is filling his head with all kinds of ideas. We're worried about him. And about you. This isn't who you are." There it was again. "You're not the person you've become." Not because I was angry. Not because I'd stood up for myself. But because I'd stopped playing along. They missed the old version of me, the one who stayed quiet, who didn't question them, who carried the weight of every broken promise and every empty seat. The girl who kept the peace while her brother faked his way through life and her parents clapped for it like it was courage. Jamie came home from work and found me sitting at the table with the card still open. I didn't say a word, just slid it over to him. He read it once, sighed, and said, "They're not sorry, babe. They're just scared. You changed the script." And he was right. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because for the first time in their lives, they weren't in control. Neil was building a life without them. I had cut the strings for good. And the story they'd told themselves for years, that they were good parents, just doing their best with a sick child, was unraveling fast. But the final confirmation came from Kay. She called the next evening, voice buzzing with urgency. "I wasn't going to say anything," she started, "but I just talked to Neil. Your mom showed up at his apartment." My stomach dropped. "She begged him to talk to you," Kay said. "Not because she misses you, but because she's terrified more family members are starting to see the truth." Apparently, Neil told her point blank that he wasn't going to play messenger anymore. That if she wanted a relationship with me, she'd have to start by taking responsibility for everything she'd done, not papering it over with carefully worded apologies and emotional guilt trips. Kay paused. "And you know what she said?" "What?" I asked. She said, "I don't know what's gotten into both of you, but I'm not going to be villainized in my own family." There it was. That was her truth. Not regret. Not understanding. Just fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being held accountable. That night, I wrote my mother and father one final email. It was short, cold, honest. You are not the victims. You were not doing your best. And I no longer have any interest in pretending otherwise. If you ever want a future with me, it starts with one thing, an apology, not for how I reacted, but for what you did. Until then, I wish you peace. But not access. I haven't heard back. I don't expect to. And that silence? That's finally starting to feel like peace. But there was still one final chapter to close. The day Neil and I visited the house we grew up in, and the truth we buried beneath its walls. The sun was low when we pulled up to the old house. That late afternoon light, the kind that casts long shadows, slid across the front porch like a memory you can't quite shake. Neil had texted me a week earlier, out of the blue, asking if I wanted to see it one last time before our parents sold it. They were moving south, some retirement community in Florida, and had finally decided to let go of the house we'd grown up in. Or maybe the house that raised us, because I'm not sure our parents ever really did. Jamie offered to come with me, but I told him this one I had to do alone with Neil. He was already there when I pulled up, leaning against the hood of his car, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, eyes locked on the place like he wasn't sure if it was real or just a projection from some other life. "Hey," I said as I walked up beside him. "Hey," he replied, barely above a whisper. "Looks smaller than I remember." "They always do," I said. We stood there a moment before walking to the front steps. The porch still creaked the same way it used to when we snuck out past curfew. The screen door still had that tiny rip in the corner. Everything looked the same, but none of it felt the same. The realtor had left a key in a lockbox. We let ourselves in. The smell hit first. Not musty, just stale. Like time had been trapped inside for years, never opening a window, never letting anything new in. The living room was empty now, but I could still see the outlines of the couch where Neil would lie with a blanket over his head while I set the table for dinner. Ignored again because he wasn't feeling well. We walked room to room without saying much. I stepped into what used to be my bedroom. Tiny, sunlit, still painted that pale blue my mom chose when I was 7. I remembered taping my science fair ribbons to the wall and how she'd replaced them once with a photo of Neil in the hospital after one of his episodes. She said it was a more important moment for the family. I stared at the empty walls now, stripped of all of it. It was just a room again. Finally, Neil came up behind me, hands in his pockets. "I used to come in here when you weren't home," he said, voice shaky. "Not to mess with your stuff. I think I was trying to figure out what made you so different. You always kept going, even when they didn't see you." I turned to him, not with anger, not with pity, just honesty. I didn't have the option to stop. He nodded. "I know that now. We went down to the basement last. That's where they kept the trophies, Neil's soccer plaques, my academic awards. I found the box labeled college stuff. Inside, I saw the framed article from the local paper about my scholarship to the summer science program I never got to attend. It was yellowed now, folded, shoved behind some of Neil's baby pictures. They kept it," I said aloud. Not because it meant anything, but because for a second, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. "They never threw you away," Neil said. "They just buried you." That line hung in the air like dust in sunlight. I turned to him, finally asking the question I had held onto for years. "Why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you speak up?" He looked at me, eyes rimmed red. "Because they made me feel like I'd vanish if I did. Like being sick was the only way I mattered." He paused, then added, "But God, you were real. You were something. And that scared them. It scared me." There it was. The truth. Raw and naked and painful. But it didn't make me angry. It made me free. We stepped out of that house together, two adults no longer defined by the walls that once held us prisoner. I locked the door behind us, but it felt more like closing a book than securing a building. As we stood by our cars, Neil turned to me. "You think we'll ever be close?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "Not the way we could have been," I said. "But maybe the way we need to be now." He nodded. "That's enough." We hugged then, not because we were trying to reclaim lost time, but because, for the first time in our lives, we were meeting each other as equals. Not rivals, not shadows, just two people raised in the same storm, finally finding sunlight on the other side. I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind clear the air inside me. Jamie was waiting with dinner and open arms, and as I sat beside him that night, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole, because I finally understood. Healing doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It means living like it won't happen again. And I was finally living.